Oh. Hi, come on in. We're just getting ready to broadcast. Come on and have a seat.
Thank you. I have something for you. Since you are deep in the subject.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
It's another
That's
version
fabulous.
of what happens.
Oh my gosh. I'm running back there after the, oh, look how beautiful your parents are. I'm running back, I'm at FAU
Oh,
Holocaust Center.
hello, everybody.
Hi, how are you? Ron, are we good to get started? We're, it's
Yeah,
amazing.
I'm about to let people in.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hi, Sylvie. How are you?
Thank you so much. You should speak to FAU. You should. Okay, Ron, I'm gonna let them in. All right, good afternoon to those in the room and those who are on Zoom and all the other platforms. It's great to see you. This is the third week of a 4-week teaching I'm doing about what I learned on sabbatical, though I think in some ways, like when you're doing things deep and interesting, it reverberates in other parts of your life. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit more about Rabin and Sadat, look at them through the context of some American experiences, and then if we have time, go into the other topic that I did, which was rescuers during the Holocaust. And right now, I left for a little bit, but I'm at FAU at a seminar for teachers who teach the Holocaust. And I cannot tell you how hard it is to be a teacher in Florida and know what to say and what not to say in ways like never before. I mean, it's really hug a teacher if they want to be hugged, but they have their work cut out for them. What I want to point out is we delve into Rabin and Sadat and my goal of kind of looking at their lives side by side, but not to clean it up and make it pretty, is that things that they dealt with are still in the news today. Just yesterday, I believe, or 2 days ago, there was a vote about an expansion in the West Bank where Smotrich was given kind of this free reign, a shockingly free reign. Israeli press has undercovered it, underexposed it or undercovered it. But the West Bank figured prominently into the concerns of Sadat, who really wanted to give it back. And Rabin was also not so tied to the West Bank. Rabin cared about Jerusalem, and he felt Jerusalem should be a part of Israel, and he was willing to fight for Jerusalem, but areas like Judea and Samaria, he would rather have a peace. That reflects Rabin as a secular Jew, but he did have a special place for Jerusalem. So it's just ironic or interesting or not ironic that the West Bank is in the news this very week. The other thing that's just an enduring legacy, which we're reminded of both in Egypt and in Israel, is that how fragile peace is. If you look at, we're going to kind of look at these two moments of Rabin and Sadat and them at the same time, and then what led to both of their assassinations, and how Sadat more so than Rabin, but even Rabin, peace was so fragile and delicate that there's really Sadat and Rabin got the farthest, I think, to peace in those regions, and there's been no one who's been able to do what they've done since. I think I read a reading Friday night. It said, it was 17 years from Sadat's visit to Jerusalem until Rabin's visit to DC, and there hasn't been a historic visit like that from either nation since then. You could argue the UAE and the Abraham Accords are significant, but not. It doesn't involve Egypt. So it's painful in a way. It just shows how delicate Rabin and Sadat were. It also shows how visionary these two men were. And I wanted to start with two things that I think reflect the poem that I started with last time. For those who weren't here, I shared a Shaul Chernikovsky poet, which says, man is the shape of his land. In other words, wherever you grow up, and Sylvie just gave me her book, which talks about her childhood were you in Belgium or where I was born? Yeah, in Belgium, and then fleeing and the family, that's the shape of your personhood, even though you're sitting in Boca Raton. And, you know, Judith is from Chicago. I know these in Baltimore, New York, New York, you know, whoever, these things stay with us. So what is hard is that, and I want to show you kind of the consequences when you don't have a land of your childhood that is safe for you, or that loves you, or you love it, it creates a much more complicated life. And Rabin and Sadat both had lands that they loved tremendously and lands that loved them. And remember, both men wanted to be farmers. And I want to contrast that. And this kind of lets me synthesize the Holocaust piece, which I'll get to next week, where when you have these people who are raised to flee or raised to completely lose their childhood, it creates a much more complicated person. And it's almost parallel to, if you think about Moses and the children of Israel, the only one who could lead the children of Israel from slavery to freedom was Moses, because he grew up in freedom, while all the children of Israel who were raised in slavery couldn't complete that task. It's the same thing here, where you needed a Rabin or Sadat to be so secure in what their country was and their country's history, and so secure that they could imagine peace would be better. Look, it wasn't from the get-go, and it wasn't the whole time, but towards the end of their lives, and ultimately, you know, before their assassination, they knew that risk for peace was worth it because they had confidence in the land. And I want to share, just because he spoke at my seminar in DC, and because it was such a shock to me, I didn't know. Abraham Foxman was very, very well known, a Jewish professional. He's the head of the Anti-Defamation League for he was the head for 30 years, but worked there for 50 years. I didn't know this until he spoke to our group in person at the Holocaust Museum. He was a hidden child, and there was a famous case. Anyone aware of this about Abe Foxman? So Abe Foxman was hidden by his nanny, and he was baptized, given a new name, raised Christian. Then when the war ended, he grown so attached to the nanny, and the parents and the nanny and Abe Foxman, we're all going to live together. And then in Europe, and then the nanny wanted to kidnap him and take him, and felt that this was my child now. And then what she would do is sabotage the father. So like the father would go to work, and the nanny would come and say he's harassing people or stealing money. And so the father kept being arrested. And finally, believe it or not, the case went to court. And it was going to be decided in court who would get the child, the nanny or his actual biological parents. Ultimately, his biological parents won, and they left. They didn't leave till 1950. But for a long time, Abe Foxman would still cross himself when did you have a similar experience? Yeah.
If I may just interrupt for a minute.
Sure.
So years later, I came to the States and everything, and I was working in the delivery room. And in those days, you know, if you had a baby, that was born really dead, if it was a Catholic baby, that died right away. We couldn't wait for the priest. So, and we, the nurses, were responsible for doing that.
Right.
So I had a situation that happened, and I'm looking at these little figures, and I'm going, I baptize thee in the name of the Padre del Hijo y del Espíritu Santo. I had to say it in Spanish because that was where I came from, and that's how I knew about the Catholic religion, and I knew that that's what they say, and I couldn't say it in English. I was mixed up. I couldn't say the ghost and the spirit and the body. The Padre del Hijo y del Espíritu Santo, which means the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, and that's what I did.
Mixed up is the perfect word, because that's kind of the point I'm getting to, that Rabin and Sadat were never mixed up about their identity the way many of us are. I mean, think where your grandparents were born, or your great grandparents, or where you were born, or even New York to Florida, or Chicago to California. It's different. Rabin and Sadat were always in the land. So Foxman, I'll just show you this short clip. So it was created a lot of confusion. And some of the other texts we looked at also talked about Ron, our awesome producer, just make sure you're letting people in. Thanks. Another text we read talked about someone who was hidden in a convent. They found a relative who was living, an uncle. Parents had died, and the uncle made aliyah, and the person hated their life. They would have rather stayed a Jew, be a Catholic in Poland than a Jew in Israel. Created a real mix-up, and I'll just share with that. And it's in stark contrast to what Rabin and Sadat experienced. So let me just put this
Opportunity with an audience to meet him, inside the red Prada shoes, there's a certain warmth and a gentleness. I asked him to bless the memory of my nanny during the war, Catholic nanny who baptized me, risked her life to save me. He stood up, he asked me to approach him, he embraced me and thanked me for touching his heart. Then held my hand and said, I will always be there for you when you fight anti-Semitism. It's different than the image that people have. And so the warmth, the feeling of closeness, of emotion is there.
Thank you, Abe Foxman. If you can get more of Abe Foxman, Abe Foxman actually published his father's journal of what happened. It's quite a story, and Abe doesn't lead with it. I mean, I've heard him speak. I never knew this until he spoke to us, and it was very moving because it was a room full of mostly Christian scholars. As I said, I want to, yeah.
How did he turn things around to eventually, I'm assuming, meld with his family?
He is in pain still. You can see the pain on his face till this day. It's a lot of confusion. It's a lot of confusion, and he has Orthodox, children and grandchildren, but it's always there. It's just always there.
The bonding that happened.
Yeah, it's the bonding. And also what happened is often when someone's hidden in a convent or it was more girls that were hidden because boys, because of circumcision, was harder to hide because the Nazis could look and see. So more girls were hidden in convents. And they had to be the best Catholics. And so they would learn these prayers. And, as I said, I'm studying at this FAU seminar this week, and they talk about who's left now are child survivors mostly. And part of the problem is those weren't the people who went through the camps for the most part. Some did, but most were hidden. So they're not so aware of the history because they were in hiding kind of away from it all. So it's just a lot of things. And I want to contrast that because, again, I'm contextualizing. I have the microphone, so to speak. We talk about power and who's the money and the power and the perspective that you're giving. So from where I'm sitting, where I spent this week studying these two subjects side by side, kind of the takeaway for me was that in looking through at Sadat and Rabin, that intense love of country, whether it was Egypt or Israel, that intense love of the land, that Rabin and Sadat were really the shape of their land. In a way, I wouldn't say I'm the shape of my land. Like, I love Israel, I love America too, but I love Israel. I'm not the shape of one land. And, if it came down to it and, I mean, I know I can always go to Israel, but so that doesn't mean I'm not happy here. So I'm not the shape. I think I'm more the shape of Israel, even though I don't live there, but is that fair for me to say that? Because my kids aren't going there, while Rabin and Sadat really, and you think about, like moving your children around and things like that, like what it did for Rabin and Sadat and allow them to think with more security into their land. So I want to play a song that I think better reflects surely where Rabin is coming from. Sadat, probably Sadat also. Where'd you go? Probably Sadat as well. Let me just pull it up. It's a song called Ainli Eretz Acheret, and it is a song. I pulled up all my things and they're all gone. Ainli. It's a song about. Does anyone know what that means? Ainli Eretz Acheret. It means I have no other land. When Rabin was assassinated, there was an album that was put out. I think it was Shalom Chaver, it was called, after what Rabin said at, what Clinton said at Rabin's funeral. And you'll see the song in Hebrew and English here, Ainli Eretz Acheret, I have no other land. And this has been played again with the judicial reforms going on, what's happening. Like, there's no other land. So
And
we
go.
have,
Do
oh God,
this
sorry.
to clear out stuck poop fast. Fiber helps you poop, right?
אין לי ארץ אחרת, גם אם אדמתי בוערת, רק מילה בעברית חודרת אל אורכי, אל נשמתי, בגוף כואב, בלב רעב, כאן הוא ביתי. לא אשתוק יצי שינתה את פניה, לא אוותר להזכיר לך ואשיר כאן באוזניה עד שתפקח את עיניה.
So you get the idea. Ainli Eretz Acheret, I have no other land. And that sentiment, Sadat was never in danger of losing Egypt, but Sadat's big upsettedness was that there was always a foreign leader or a foreign ruler. And what is ironic, and this is kind of the place where I'll start saying, looking at their two lives, and especially the overlap, is that they both had a huge dislike for the British. So that is because in the 1940s, and this is again earlier in their time, they were both imprisoned by the British. What happened? So in the 1940s, just a little reminder of history, you have World War II, and you have both for Egypt and, it's British Mandate Palestine at the time, you have Egyptian soldiers and Jewish soldiers fighting side by side with British soldiers in these British brigades. But what's happening in North Africa, especially, and this is why Sadat goes to jail, if you remember, the Egyptians there are some Egyptians, this rebellious group of which Nasser Gamal Abdel Nasser is a part of, dear friend, best friend of Sadat, and a bunch of other young men who had known each other since young, that were starting to try to communicate with the Nazis, not so much for the genocide part of them, but for the getting rid of the British, of rebelling, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. On the British side, you have, of course, Britain controlling British Mandate Palestine and not allowing either 45, 46, 47, 48, the state to be. And what is ironic, and this is like, again, I told you I'm not going to clean this up and make this neat, but Rabin and Sadat were both in British prisons in their respective lands when at this like 47, 48 time. Sadat was in prison much longer, and in prison, Sadat learned, what he had learned as a farmer, this patience, this it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And this Sadat talks about, Sadat was much more lyrical in his language. Rabin was really an introvert. He was kind of a cranky guy. He made Clinton promise he wasn't gonna have Arafat kiss him on the lawn, like he, when he came to the White House in the 90s. Rabin was much more reserved. Sadat was more flourishy with his language, even though he had been quieter. And they were both in prison. And Sadat kind of got to this transcendent state. So even though he had been raised with this hate of British and British monarchy and elitism, even at the same time, he'd been educated in royal schools. He ultimately, his long game, at some point clicked in that peace was going to be the long game. It didn't mean he didn't fight Israel and hate Israel and refuse to acknowledge Israel for a long period of time, and he didn't be willing to collaborate with the Nazis. But there was something deep inside in that formative time in British prison where he formed this potential for peace. Rabin, I think, was always just oriented to whatever the nation needed of him. If you think about the Middle East, like the Arab world has friends. They don't all get along, and there's a lot of inter-Arab conflict, and that was the big thing that isolated Sadat from a lot of his followers. Rabin only had Israel, right? So there's two very different mentalities. But what differentiated Sadat, and which played out over the years, is the Arab world, and even people like Jimmy Carter thought that you could have a pan-Arab cooperation, that you could treat the Arab world as one and make peace with the Arab world as one, and peace would be found. But anyone who kind of sits in that space knows, even in Egypt, even with Sadat, there's a lot of dictatorship, there's a lot of killing, a lot of getting rid of the enemy. They're called democracies, but a lot of these nations are not democracies. You know, you look from Turkey to Morocco to Yemen to Saudi Arabia to, you know, it's not a democracy like we know here. And Sadat started to realize that Egypt needed to stand alone. And that cost him a lot of enemies in the Arab world. And it also cost him enemies in his own country. Because the biggest transgression, of course, would ultimately be making peace with Israel, where if you're in an Arab mindset, you're not even acknowledging that the state has a right to exist. So there's a lot of complexity there. So what happens, I want to give you two case studies from the 70s. They're kind of funny, and they have to do with Amy Carter, one of them, which is just funny because I was like around her age, I think, and you know, you always remembered Amy Carter, and it's like a funny little story. So I want to give you a Sadat example and a Rabin example. So Sadat, Henry Kissinger had a really significant role. You know, it was a different time and place. Rabin served in labor governments and Likud governments. Egypt was just not as democratic in reality, and so it wasn't as cut and dry there. But in the same way in America, you had like Middle East experts often served, or security experts often served in Democrat and Republican leadership, or had a role or were extended courtesies. Like Kissinger, even though it was Clinton who was president, when Rabin was assassinated, Clinton let Kissinger go. I don't know if this all could happen today, and that's another big disappointment, but there was much more collaboration, and Rabin was part of the group that met with Sadat, even though Begin was prime minister. So there's much more interaction. But so what happened in the 70s in Israel is 73 war. The 73 war is something that, even though, so Sadat had done two false starts, right? So Moshe Dayan had gotten ready at the cost of $10 million, seeing two false starts over the summer of 73. So when there was some action going on in October of 73, Diane just said, oh, it's another practice, another maneuver. The one thing that everybody missed is the Soviets were evacuating their ambassadors from Egypt, and no one picked up on that. So when the October 73 war was planned, the Yom Kippur War, Israel was totally caught by surprise. Ultimately, what happened is Sadat at the beginning, Egypt was doing very well, joined by its Arab neighbors. And then what happened is they wanted to get Sadat to agree to peace, right? A ceasefire. Sadat got greedy. And he decided he wanted more from Israel. And in that period of time, when Sadat refused to do ceasefire, then Israel by then had reinforced its air force. The Egyptian air force was now destroyed, and I think 300 Egyptian tanks were destroyed, so the war turned. So it was better for Israel. That's why when you read from an Israeli perspective, it's always like we won the war, and when you read from the Arab perspective, it's always like they won the war, because like everybody was kind of winning, not 6 days so much. So ironically, some people felt that Sadat felt he had to fight that war in order to fight for peace. We don't know ultimately what his motivation was, but Sadat started talking more and more to Kissinger, to Nixon. But then when Sadat starts negotiating with Nixon, what's going on? Watergate. So it was a problem that anytime Sadat was coming to talk to Nixon, there were internal problems going on in the Republican Party. And in this very almost elitist, I guess like derogatory way, Sadat was coming to talk about eternal Egyptian things And the US always wanted to talk about pan-Arabism, as if they were lumping in Sadat with the rest of Egypt. But Sadat had a different mindset that he was that it would be best for Egypt, for the economy, for Egypt, for the growth, for the modernization of Egypt, for Egypt to be treated as Egypt alone. But they wanted this pan-Arabism. But Sadat was a really, really good negotiator. So what happens is the 73 war happens. They're negotiating with Meir for peace, and Sadat is very, he was such a strategic negotiator, and he wouldn't negotiate directly with Golda Meir. He would go through Kissinger, but a lot of people felt he was going through Israel to get to the United States. Like all this negotiating with Israel was really to be well treated in America's eyes. Like that was really Sadat's end game, and he just saw that like Israel's kind of puppet of the United States. Whatever was the reason, Sadat and Meir ultimately came to an agreement that the Sinai would be patrolled by Egyptian tanks. They disagreed about the number, was going to be 30 or 100. Sadat ultimately won. He got his 100 tanks in the Sinai. Golda Meir ultimately resigned. Sadat also resigned. And again, you see the differences. Golda was not asked back. Sadat unresigned right away. People wanted Sadat back. They were really happy with him. They were happy with the wars that he was fighting. So Sadat had a really, he was very firm, but he was also able to negotiate in a very warm way. It was a little different with Rabin, especially under Carter. And I just want to share with you a little bit. Rabin had a little bit of an easier time with Nixon, but then he had more trouble with Carter, partly because here, let me just share this one page and then I'll talk about this. What happens is, well, let's do Nixon first and then we'll do Carter, and you'll see kind of the difference. It was not a pretty happy relationship at all. So Rabin and Sadat are prime minister. They're overlapping a little bit of time. And this is after the war. And then Nixon and Kissinger come to the Middle East. It was a good distraction for Nixon. But strength was relative in the president. Nixon was more patient than he for a peace accord because of his own political needs. And Kissinger didn't want to tarnish his reputation for dynamism and success. Rabin would move forward, but slowly, while the flow of weaponry into Israel swelled into a flooding could be absorbed. So there were promises. That's part of the tension that existed. Both Israel and Egypt lost a lot of weapons and arms in addition to losing soldiers. And the US promised they would restock everybody. So it's like an interesting, so they're kind of mad. You know, you're mad at both, but you know you both need the US. So Nixon and Kissinger arrived in Israel June 16th, 1974, to the cheers of people crowding the sidewalk before the airport and Jerusalem. What a pleasure to hear cries of welcome instead of shouts of guilty that brutally shook Nixon in his own country. Thank you, Nixon called out. Then to his aides, they know what I've done for Israel. Now he wanted Israel to do something for him to make peace, a peace he did not have to say that would reverberate back home. Any further agreement that does not contain a meaningful political component, Rabin said, will not be a further step toward peace. For every piece of territory, the Arabs must give a visit of peace. You can see that Rabin is much tougher, that all these kind of charismatic, very polished politicians, Rabin does not care about that. Rabin is very conscious, as former head of the military, he knows what's going on. And then what happens is Carter is elected, and Ford becomes president. He likes Ford. Rabin likes Ford, but Ford, as we will learn, is not able to have an enduring legacy. Ford was just open. Ford was like a good Midwestern guy to Rabin, and he was just polite and open to talking to Rabin, but that's not what won. So what happens is like kind of this pan-Arab assumption that non-Middle Eastern makes happens with Carter. So what happens is very funny. After several hours of conversation, about peace prospects, Rabin departed carrying him a valuable gift, an ancient Torah inscribed on deerskin, which he would donate to an Israeli museum, donated as an unknown donor. Now, this came from Carter. Rabin was excited by the vision of crowning his regime with a final Egyptian peace treaty, especially with an election looming in autumn '77. He might be an amateur politician, and indeed, he had a hard time juggling the demands of the politicians. But even if he didn't achieve any final peace accord soon, he was proud of his record so far, and symbolizing his success was the arrival of first F-15s to Morocco shortly after we returned from Morocco, a timely event that could prod Sadat towards full peace. And the funniest thing about this visit, beside this donation giving of this Torah scroll that Rabin said, unknown donor, Rabin was really angry with Carter because he was coming in with this idea of a pan-Arab peace and not dealing with Egypt as Egypt. And Rabin was so frustrated that at the end of the visit, Rosalind Carter asked Rabin to sit and listen to Amy Carter play piano, and Rabin refused and he left. So it's like very funny moment. I mean, it's funny, not funny, but it's kind of like, in Israel, you're like sending your kids to the military. At the time, I think Rabin's son-in-law had been injured in a Jeep accident, was in a coma, he had fought and was like, he's not gonna listen to Amy play. Even on a good day, he's not gonna listen to Amy Carter play piano. But on this time, when he's so angry about this, he doesn't. And it just shows that Sadat was just able to have this ability, this suaveness that Rabin just wasn't concerned about. But the two men were able to somewhat be at the same table. And it shows you again, how different the world was then, because I can't imagine this happening in Israeli politics today, when a group was put together to meet with Sadat, when he ultimately did come to Jerusalem. Golda Meir was elected out of office, and Rabin, Meir resigned and Rabin was elected out of office, were both part of the people that met with Sadat. So before I go on, I'll see if there's any questions or any comments, if you remember these times. And then I want to look at the speech that Rabin gave after the '67 war and the speech that Sadat gave in Jerusalem, and talk then about looking at through the lens, their two lives through the lens of Ronald Reagan's assassination attempt, and which overlap their lives, and Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Because again, as I said, I won't clean this up, but it is true. They both had time, it says quickly, oh, Rabin had 5 months in jail and Sadat had 2 years in jail. It was nothing but whatever, 2 years in jail, if you were in jail for a night, you remember, let alone, 5 months or a year, and it influenced them. And so I want to look at through the perspective of King, who was also assassinated, and Ronald Reagan, who couldn't come. Well, the story was he couldn't come to Sadat's funeral because he was still recovering from the assassination attempt on his life earlier that year. But in truth, while Rabin's death was greeted with a lot of praises and a nation was in mourning, Sadat was really not as beloved by this time. A lot of people were mad with him, and it was an army coup that led to it was military that killed Sadat. I mean, Yigal Amir had also been in the military and killed Rabin. So a lot of world leaders felt unprotected, and so that's kind of the behind the scenes stories of why Reagan wouldn't go. But he said all the other past presidents, he just wouldn't go. So before I go on and look at these two speeches, do you remember these times clearly? Yeah.
Not clear.
Yeah.
I remembered it, but I wasn't that tuned into it.
Uh-huh.
Although I know the peace accord was very impressive.
Right. And there was a couple of years between his visit to Jerusalem, and the peace accords took a little time to iron out, and then of course the assassination was in '81. Anyone else? I think I remember. I feel like I remember Nixon's resignation, but I don't remember I don't remember the other stuff. I was young. I was 10. I would have been 10, I think, when Sadat visited Jerusalem. So I remember Reagan's assassination attempt on Reagan, and Sadat would come a few months after that. So I want to share, kind of, again, to get inside these two men, which is what I've tried to do in this sabbatical time. And so first I want to look at the speech that Rabin gave right after the 6-Day War. Now, you think, oh, the 6-Day War was a big joy, but part of Rabin's point, this was given June 28th, so right after the 6-Day War. And Rabin had a lot of anxiety. Sadat did not have anxiety. Jihan Sadat, Sadat's wife, had a lot of anxiety. Rabin had a lot of anxiety. He had a nervous breakdown right before the 6-Day War. He walked a lot. He talks about that quiet when you know a war is coming and the nation doesn't know a war is coming. Like, he sent his daughter Dalia to school on the day of the 73 war, I think, or the 6-Day War, and knowing a war is coming, knowing people will die. That's very intense pressure. And he talks about this when he gets this honorary doctorate at Hebrew University, and then he kind of shows this very just pain that's inside of him, that's there, that I think that he, as a Jewish man in Israel, could show that an Egyptian man like Sadat, just not that Sadat didn't have pain, but Sadat was a warrior. I mean, Sadat, grew up, kind of cut his teeth with these young, older teenage men, really older teenagers, 19, 20, 21, Nasser, who were like ready to kill the British and ready to kill their enemies. There was a lot of internal strife in the Egyptian party. And the only reason Sadat and Nasser were best friends, they'd known each other since 19. Sadat wasn't Nasser's puppet, but Sadat was one of the few people who wasn't diabolically like doing stuff behind the scene against Nasser, like many, many other people were in Israel. Rabin, Jewish and Israeli society, though there's a lot of division for sure, it's not that same dangerous place. Has anyone been to an Arab nation or to the West Bank or Gaza or, you've been, it's just the different, Ramallah I've been to. I don't know why I feel safe in Israel in a way I don't feel in other places. I can't explain it, but there's like, I don't know what it is. So Rabin is able to be more vulnerable. And he asked this question. It may be asked, this is right after the 6-Day War, Yitzhak Rabin. It may be asked why the university saw fit to grant the title of honorary doctor of philosophy to a soldier in recognition of his martial activities. What is there in common between military activity and the academic world, which represents civilization and culture? What is there in common between those whose profession is violence and spiritual values? And however, I'm honored that through me, you are expressing such deep appreciation by my comrades in arms. So he says, like, don't appreciate me here, but appreciate the soldiers. He really, he sees his job as violent, and he grants some praise to the military and some educational results of the military, but then he goes on kind of acknowledging the war that has just ended. Today, however, the university has conferred this honorary title upon us in recognition of the IDF's superiority of spirit and morals, as was revealed in the heat of war, for we are standing in this place by virtue of a heavy battle, which though forced upon us, was forced into a victory that is already called miraculous. War is intrinsically harsh and cruel, bloody and tear-stained, but this war in particular, which we've just undergone, brought forth rare and magnificent instances of heroism and courage, together with humane expressions of brotherhood, comradeship, and spiritual greatness. Whoever has not seen a tank crew continue their attack with their commander killed and their vehicle badly damaged, whoever has not seen soldiers endangering their lives to extricate wounded comrades from a minefield, whoever has not seen the anxiety and the effort of the entire Air Force devoted to rescuing a pilot who has fallen into enemy territory cannot know the meaning of devotion among comrade in arms. I mean, it's just heartbreaking. You see him reliving these moments. He talks about the city of Jerusalem, as he said, that's he's very attached to. That is something he's willing to fight for, not in a way he's willing to fight for the other areas. And then he talks about the fighters, and he tries to bring you into the fighter psyche. And more than this, the joy of triumph sees the entire nation. Nevertheless, we find increasingly a strange phenomena among our fighters. Their joy is not total, and more than a little sorrow and shock permeates their celebration. Those who do not celebrate at all, the warriors in the front lines, witness not only the glory of victory, but also its price. Their comrades who fell beside them bleeding. And I know that the terrible price paid by our enemies also touches the hearts of many of our men deeply. It may be that the Jewish people never accustomed themselves to experience the thrill of conquest and victory, and so we experience it with mixed feelings. I mean, it's just remarkable, the sensitivity, the depth of contemplation and reflection, and you could put that paragraph in any military, and I think that people would resonate. There's a certain, like, yes, a war was won, but at what cost? And I think that mindset is something that also Rabin and Sadat share, because they love their land so much. And you can't love your land fully if you know people are dying for your land. And so they both come to this conclusion that it needs to be peace. And Rabin was a willing partner in peace even in the 70s, but just there was a lot of internal strife in the Labor Party. I always think of him and Perez as so close, but they weren't. They fought with each other, and in some ways, like, I think there's like Team Perez and Team Rabin. In some ways, it's really Perez's fault that there wasn't peace in the 70s. He really roadblocked Rabin. It led to his defeat, and it led to Begin. Begin made peace with Egypt, but you know, it was a peace that it's a cold peace. It's certainly the economic gains that Egypt hoped to have in the Middle East, you know, because of subsequent leaders, you know, was not. There's still a lot of, you know, you could call it a democracy, but it's still not. But you also see the sensitivity to the enemy that's there. So what I want to share with you next, any questions about Rabin or any reactions to Rabin's words? I mean, they just bring tears to your eyes.
I do have a question about Sadat. What religion is he?
Muslim.
What?
Yeah. Why?
Because I know there is a lot of Christians in Egypt.
There are. So Sadat was in some ways a visionary Muslim in that he was not totally supportive of the Islamic Brotherhood, because there's a lot of infighting in Egyptian society and in the Arab world. It's funny, actually, in my listening, there was an interview with Sadat. So Alex Haley interviewed Anwar Sadat, and it was published in Playboy. It was a Playboy interview. It was like a hot interview, right, for the article. So, and there was a line that was since discovered. Kissinger talks about this in his book Leadership, or no, someone else talks about it. I don't know, that Haley made up about that Sadat didn't mind. No, Haley did an interview with Martin Luther King about the Muslim Brotherhood and about Malcolm X, and there was much more. You know, people want to see a fight and they want to see tension, and there's much more peace and affinity amongst these leaders. They can resonate more with each other, and so we want to see a battle and differences, and like there was more affinity that was there. Sorry, I muddled my leaders. I mean, there's a great new podcast about King, and a new book about King. Okay, now to not confuse you more, let's go to Sadat and Jerusalem and his visit. And this visit was humongous in Israel. Like, there was a joke at the Knesset, there was like a vote the day Sadat's flight was flying out, and like no one, because there was like very few Israeli channels, so there's hardly anything on TV. So Sadat's visit was really well covered, and everyone, you know, watched this plane land and watched the plane take off, and there was just a lot. And so this is Sadat at the Knesset during his visit to Israel, and then his his speech. Let me just go back here. Hold on. That's there. Do you remember that? I don't, again, like, I should have remembered it, I feel like, but, hold on. Let me go on the speech. Okay. Let's have someone, online read. Barbara, are you still there? Do you want to read? We cannot hear you. I think you have to unmute.
Unmute.
Go ahead.
Okay, I don't know why I don't have a picture. Hold on. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, we truly welcome you to live among us in peace and security. In the name of God, Mr. Speaker of the Knesset, ladies and gentlemen, allow me first to thank deeply the Speaker of the Knesset for affording me this opportunity to address you. As I begin my address, I wish to say, peace and the mercy of God Almighty be upon you, and may peace be with us all, God willing. Peace for us all of the Arab lands and in Israel, as well as in every part of this big world, which is so beset by conflicts, perturbed by its deep contradictions, menaced now and then by destructive wars launched by man to annihilate his fellow man. Finally, amidst the ruins of what man has built among the remains of the victims of mankind, there emerges a neither victor nor vanquished. The only vanquished remains always a man, God's most sublime creation, man, whom God has created, as Gandhi, the apostle of peace, puts it, to forge ahead, to mold the way of life, and to worship God Almighty. I come to you today on solid ground to shape a new life and to establish peace. We all love this land, the land of God. We all, Muslim, Christians, and Jews, all worship God. Under God, God's teaching and commandments are love, sincerity, security, and peace. I do not blame all those who received my decision when I announced it to the entire world before the Egyptian People's Assembly. I do not blame all those who received my decision with surprise and even amazement, some gripped even by violent surprise. Still others interpreted it as political, to camouflage my intentions of launching a new war.
Hold on one second. I'm just going to jump to the end. Here, a durable and just peace.
Okay. Then we proceeded, trying both opened and closed doors in a bid to find a certain road leading to a durable and just peace. We opened our heart to the peoples of the entire world to make them understand our motivations and objectives, and actually to convince them of the fact that we are advocates of justice and peacemakers. Motivated by all these factors, I also decided to come to you with an open mind and an open heart, and with a conscious determination so that we might establish permanent peace based on justice. It is so fated that my trip to you, which is a journey of peace, coincided with the Islamic feast, the holy feast of the sacrifice with Abraham, peace be upon him. Forefather of the Arabs and Jews, submitted to God, I say, when God Almighty ordered him, not out of weakness, but through a giant spiritual force and by free will, to sacrifice his own son, personified by firm and unshakable belief in ideals that had for mankind a profound significance. Ladies and gentlemen, let us be frank with each other, using straightforward words and a clear conception with no ambiguity. Let us be frank with each other today, while the entire world, both East and West, follows these unparalleled moments, which could prove to be a radical turning point in the history of this part of the world, if not in the history of the world as a whole.
Okay, so let's talk about the two assassinations. After this, things did not get better for Sadat in Egypt, and many were not supportive of this gesture to make peace with Israel. And what started to happen, and again, it's a democracy, but it's, I don't even know how you call democracy with like a dictator characteristics, but he would have people killed or removed from office when there was word of a coup or a rebellion attempt that was coming down the line. And it is so ironic. So even though that, he'd come and made this gesture of peace, the October War. We call it the Yom Kippur War, but the Arab world calls it the October War, and they view it as a victory. So even though you're trying to make peace with Egypt, it'd be like if like America had a World War II celebration day, you know, like it was that kind of thing where they had a military processional celebrating the October War victory, the Yom Kippur War victory. Wasn't such a clean victory. And so the irony of, so that was in a grandstand, and what happened is a military vehicle slowed down full of soldiers, Egyptian soldiers who had planned this assassination, got out. So they came by the grandstand, slowed their vehicle, came down. Sadat had not worn a bulletproof vest, neither had Rabin when we come to his assassination, and he was assassinated. I think 11 others were killed as well. I think including the Cuban ambassador was killed. And his death, things were very quiet in Egypt. If you were in Israel after Rabin's death, you saw Rabin the week before, right? You had seen Rabin the week before Jim did. People were lining up to view his casket at the Knesset. The funeral was delayed a week so that Clinton and others could attend. It was very different in Egypt. People were not so much in mourning. Some were, but it wasn't like when Nasser died. Gamal Abdel Nasser died of a heart attack. It was not the same way Sadat, and that's why a lot of world leaders attended. Prince Charles at the time, leaders of many countries, as I said, not Reagan, but three past presidents. So it was ironic that at a celebration of defeating Israel, in the grandstand, Sadat is killed. Like, just the irony of that hit me preparing for this. So fast forward to the situation in Israel. What happens is Rabin is reelected prime minister in 92. Remember, he had to resign. It was very embarrassing for the family. At the time in Israel, you weren't allowed to have a foreign bank account. Leah Rabin had set up a foreign bank account when Rabin was ambassador to the UN, and he was ambassador to the United States or the UN. Now, one or the other. Someone can correct me. Yeah, from Israel, and I think to the United States. And Leah Rabin opened a bank account. Reporter dug in. He went. Dan Margolita's his name. He literally went to the bank in the 70s and said, "Oh, I have a check to deposit for Leah Rabin. I owe her money, but I don't have her bank account number." And in New York, the banker says, "Oh, I'll deposit it to her account." So that's how I discovered there was a bank account, and before, like, online deposit, right, and all that. So he was reelected in 92, and I lived in Jerusalem in 94. I was in my fourth year of rabbinical school. So I remember, Rabin was inching towards peace, shaking hands with Yasser Arafat on the lawn. He was not going to go till the last minute. He was very skeptical of Arafat. Arafat had his own contingencies. Even in DC, Rabin's in the hotel, and he's like, Arafat better not wear a military uniform. Arafat wasn't. He was wearing like a safari suit, which looked military-ish. It was like all these subtle details. Rabin's like, "Don't let Arafat kiss me. Like, I don't want to kiss." Not because he don't want to kiss him. He's just not a kisser. I'm not a kisser either, so I get it. 100%. He was an introvert, and there was a lot of pressure. And then the year later, you have in Israel on the wall, peace with Jordan, which is a warm peace, and then you have on the walls in cities like Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, pictures of Rabin dressed in a keffiyeh or dressed in a Nazi uniform, because what had started to be taught in the ultra-Orthodox world, in the Jewish world, of which Yigal Amir was a part of, was that this concept of a roda, that if someone is pursuing you, right, and if someone's going to kill a Jew, you're allowed to kill that person. So there was this teaching going on in some of the ultra-Orthodox world that Rabin was leading to Jewish deaths by giving back and making peace with these areas of land. And so he needed to be killed. He was a roda that needed to be killed because he was causing the death of other Jewish life. Yigal and Chagai Amir, Chagai was his brother, lived in a very secular neighborhood in Herzliya, but were very Orthodox. They stalked Rabin for about 2 years. Yigal was a law student. They would protest outside Rabin's residence, but security was very lax. You could walk outside Rabin's house. I one night walked by. He was not in Jerusalem as much as he was in Tel Aviv, but one night the whole cabinet was at his house for dinner, and everyone kept coming out. Shulmita Oloni, Shimon Parasite, but the whole cabinet. It was so cool because there were no bars up. You know, there was some police there. Rabin on the weekend dismissed his private car he dismissed his government car and drove his own car. So Yigal could really state that Rabin had really low security. And when, the peace rally of November 4th, 1995 was coming, he was urged by a security detail to wear a bulletproof vest. And he said, I don't want to live in a country and be prime minister of a place I have to wear a bulletproof vest. And ultimately it cost him his life. And so, you look at, as I said, my last two kind of connections, we won't look at them, but my last two thoughts as kind of synthesizing all this material, comparing these lives side by side, is that the two men, Sadat and Rabin, had spent jail time, both with the British, because of the British, in jail. And as different as you want to make them, that time in jail, Sadat's was longer than Rabin's, gave them a lot of time to think about how ironic that here they are in their nation, they are the shape of their land, and someone is coming in and telling them how to act in their land. And again, they did everything that they could to make that land an independent land. Rabin was the 5th prime minister. Sadat, this was kind of the 3rd. It depends how you look at. There was a government a little bit before Nasser. There was monarchy, a lot of different things. But they were so early in the lives of these countries, and yet they were able. And you can see it in the language Sadat at Hebrew. Sadat at the Knesset and Rabin at Hebrew. Like, they're human, and like that ability to say, I believe in peace. So like Martin Luther King, letter from a Birmingham jail, look at it on your own. It's like time to contemplate, what does that do to these men? And then the other thing is Ronald Reagan's assassination attempt right before Sadat is assassinated for celebrating a war, defeating Israel. You just see how interconnected everything is, and how fragile peace was, that both nations are nowhere near the peace that Sadat and Rabin initiated. And I just want to end with this beautiful, I hope this is the part, this beautiful ending that Kissinger gives of his reflection of Sadat at the end of his chapter on Sadat and his book Leadership. So hopefully you can all hear it there.
It will be very painful for the Israelis to give up this territory. It would hurt the Jewish people too much to see you in Cairo celebrating with us. You should come a month later. Then you and I can drive alone to Mount Sinai, where I intend to build a synagogue, a mosque, and a church. This will be a better commemoration. Sadat was assassinated at a parade to celebrate the watershed event which he had initiated and which had transformed the Middle East.
So that's how sensitive Sadat is, that when Sharm el-Sheikh is given back, that Kissinger shouldn't come, because it will be painful for him as a Jew to see Israel give back this land, but come eventually as my friend. And I'm going to show you where I'm going to build a mosque and a temple, a synagogue, and a church on the top of Mount Sinai, still not built. And I think that's the ultimate, the lesson of their lives. Like, we still have to strive towards peace, towards building symbolically or physically or in whatever way we can that mosque, that church, and that synagogue at the top of Mount Sinai that we all share. So I want to thank everyone. Next week, the final week of this, we'll look at what I looked at the Holocaust Museum, which was Christian rescue during the Holocaust. Also really like things I never would have had time to think about if I wasn't given this privilege of study. So thanks Ron, our awesome producer. Thanks everyone on Zoom.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great week. I'm taking attendance here.
Yeah, a little.